Good afternoon. We are working on finishing up Chapter 7, learning about Minnesota becoming a state, Minnesota's newcomers. We are on page 132, turning points. So that is number 7 on the back side of our reading guides. Question number 7 said, why did European settlers start pouring into Minnesota around 1852? What happened that everybody was able to start coming here? So let's listen.
Turning point. The 1851 treaties marked the beginning of a dramatic change in Minnesota's population. By 1852, European American settlers were starting to pour into the territory, even though the treaties said they were supposed to stay away until 1854. They began claiming land that they hoped to buy from the U.S. government when it became legal to do so. The government allowed settlers to move onto the land early because it was eager for Minnesota to have enough people to become a state. By trespassing on land that was still in the possession of Native people, both the government and the settlers were violating treaty obligations.
So remember, we had talked about the treaties that were made with the Dakota to get the land because we want to become a state. These treaties said, yep, Dakota are giving up the land and moving to the reservations, but they were supposed to have until 1854 to do it. But the settlers couldn't wait. They wanted to come here so badly that they were coming early, and they were trespassing because it was too soon. The U.S. government didn't own the land yet. So let's see why they were coming.
These new arrivals, both men and women, came with high hopes and with plans to build lives in this new place. For many, their goal was owning their own land and being their own boss. The vast majority of them were from Europe and New England, where land ownership was associated with wealth and high status in society. Many of them had never before had such a good opportunity. They saw Minnesota as a place where people like themselves could finally become landowners.
It's chock full of reasons. So make sure you're putting down some of those reasons from that paragraph. Now let's look at the sidebar, that blue box, treaties for land in northern Minnesota. Who was living in northern Minnesota at this time? Bridget? The Ojibwe. Right, so all these treaties that we had been learning about were the Dakota. Now we're going to learn about what was happening with the Ojibwe in northern Minnesota.
Treaties for land in northern Minnesota. In the previous chapter, you learned about two important treaties between the Dakota and the U.S. government in 1851, one at Traverse des Sioux and the other at Mendota. These treaties opened up much of southern Minnesota for settlement. Americans were also eager to move into northern Minnesota, which was Ojibwe land. For this to happen, major land treaties would need to be signed by the U.S. government and the Ojibwe. In 1854, the Ojibwe ceded or turned over much of northeastern Minnesota to the U.S. government. The next year, 1855, the government also purchased a large chunk of north-central Minnesota. Lands in northwestern Minnesota remained in Ojibwe control until the 1860s, but thousands of acres were eventually ceded in that region as well. In return for the land, the Ojibwe negotiated for reservations and annuity payments, just as the Dakota had done. Both groups saw that the world they lived in was changing. They did their best to secure a deal they believed would benefit them.
So question number 8, how did the treaties of 1854 and 1855 impact the Ojibwe of northern Minnesota? How did their life change? What happened after these treaties took place?
These decisions were not easy for any American Indian nation to make. Allowing others to settle on and change the landscape their ancestors had lived on for generations was painful. It was all the more difficult when they realized the government sometimes acted in a dishonest way. In 1858, Ojibwe leader Flatmouth, or Eshkiba Kikoje, said, "When the treaty was written, I thought it was for the good of my people. You have explained it and we understand it, but it has not been fulfilled. Flatmouth was upset because the U.S. government had paid fur traders, not the Ojibwe, the amount of money promised in the signed treaty. There have been disagreements about the treaties over the years. Even so, many of the Ojibwe reservations created by the treaties of 1854 and 1855 still exist today. They include Grand Portage, Fond du Lac, Leech Lake, and White Earth.
So if you go up into northern Minnesota, there are still reservations up there that are almost 200 years old. Pretty cool. But if you look back at that paragraph before, what was the problem that was happening? They did the treaties. What problem happened? What problem were the Ojibwe faced with? Who was listening? Look back at that paragraph before. What happened? Nolan.
The Ojibwe had to give up a lot of the northern Minnesota.
Which they agreed to, so that's not the problem. They didn't want to give up the land, but they knew, oh, there's all these white settlers coming in, and remember, their numbers are staying the same, but there's more and more settlers keep coming, so they're like, we have to agree to it, so we can at least get something for our land. What problem happens, Robbie?
They don't get the money that they were promised.
Where have we seen something like that before? Eleanor?
In the last treaty?
With the Dakota. When the Dakota, remember, when they signed the treaty, they said, we want a copy for ourselves so we can make sure to hold you accountable. So they signed Treaty 1 for the U.S. government. They signed Treaty 2 for them to have, and then they signed the third paper, which they thought was signing the treaty again. Well, what was it really? Eleanor?
Them signing that they would give a lot of money to the traders.
Yeah, that money that they were promised from the treaties would go straight to the fur traders, because the fur traders were going bankrupt. They were in debt because nobody was paying for the pelts, and they needed the money that the Indians owed them, the American Indians. They needed their money so they could pay off their debt. And we're not sure how the mistake happened, but the Dakota thought they were signing the treaty, but really they were signing papers saying, yeah, we'll give you all that money straight to the fur traders. Well, now the same thing's happening to the Ojibwe. The Ojibwe said, okay, you're giving us cash annuities, you're giving us the reservation land, but all of a sudden, that money that was part of our treaty, you just gave it away to the fur traders. We need that money. Because remember, American Indians didn't have money before the Europeans came. They had no money system. Now they have to exist in a world where they need money. So it was super important that they got this money from the government. It was important for the fur traders to get the money so they don't go into debt and go bankrupt. But it was important for the American Indians. And they're like, oh my goodness, we just made these treaties with you and you're already breaking them. So there's a lot of trouble brewing. But we are going to learn about one Swedish immigrant. There were immigrants coming from all over. We're going to learn about Hans Matson and what he faced. Now the question that we're answering about him is talking about what happened in the winter. What problems did Hans Matson face during his first winter? So first we're going to learn about Hans Matson, who he is, what he's about before we get into that first winter. So follow along so you know who Hans Matson is. So don't turn your page, Mark. We're going to follow along so we know who Hans Matson is. If you have to go.
One Swedish immigrant. Hans Matson arrived in Minnesota in the fall of 1853. His journey to the young territory had been a long one. Matson had grown up on a small farm in southern Sweden. His life was good there, but he yearned for adventure. Matson had heard stories about the United States, how huge stretches of fertile land were opening to settlers, many of whom came from Europe. He decided to become one of those settlers.
So he's living over in Sweden, and he's saying, oh, look at how awesome the United States looks. It's this new country. There's all this newness to it. I want to be a part of that. And so he's seeing the adventure that there is in America. So he decides to come over to America.
In 1850, at age 17, Hans Matson boarded a ship and crossed the Atlantic Ocean. During the next 2 years, he lived on the East Coast, working at various jobs and saving up enough money to buy his own land out west. He wrote letters to his family and even to newspapers in Sweden, urging others to join him. At age 20, Matson led a group of fellow Swedish immigrants, including his parents, his sister, and his brother-in-law, to find a new home in Minnesota.
How old is Hans? Before that. How old was he when he first came to the United States? 17. My daughter Gianna is 17. She's a senior in high school. This would be her going all the way over to Europe, to a country that doesn't speak English, and starting her life out there by herself. Now, I could send her over to Italy and live with relatives. That's not what Hans did. He's not living with relatives. He came by himself to a land that does not speak his language because he was so excited for the adventure. It's pretty amazing when a young person is able to do that. I can't imagine my own kids having that confidence and being able to go out there and survive and thrive. It's amazing what these immigrants do. Even in today's world, there are immigrants that do that, that come up seeking a new life, seeking a better life. James?
It'll give me a lot of
It would give me a lot of anxiety too, but not Hans. He thrived.
The land they claimed was about 12 miles west of Red Wing. The first 4 miles we followed the territorial road, Matson wrote. After that, we had nothing but Indian trails to guide us. After establishing a settlement in this place, they later named it Vasa, after a Swedish king.
So they make it to Minnesota. They're on a territorial road that wagons go on, and then they have to go off the road to find their land. And they're just going on these paths that are there. There's nothing there. There's not a town. There's not neighbors to help them. They're doing it all themselves. Now we come to that first winter in Minnesota. We look carefully at the question. It says, what problems, plural, did Hans Matson face during his first winter, and how did he solve them? So what problems, more than one, you need to have at least 2 problems that happen that he faces during this first winter, and what he does to solve them.
The first winter in Minnesota. Matson worked most of the winter in Red Wing, chopping firewood to fuel the stoves and engines of steamboats on the Mississippi River. In January 1854, he and his brother-in-law S.I. Willard decided to travel to the land they had claimed. They wanted to chop down some trees there so they would have enough logs to build a house in the spring. They set out with 2 other men and a team of horses pulling a sleigh. The weather was mild when they started, but overnight the temperature dropped. Matson and the others learned how dangerous a Minnesota winter could be.
They don't have cell phones that go on alerts and give you the weather alert. They don't have weather apps saying, oh, temperature's changing. We know Minnesota winter. Too cold to go out for recess. We've already had a too cold to go to school day, right? Here they are traveling in a sleigh. Is there a heater that they can turn on?
Nope.
Mm-mm. They're walking next to the sleigh. They're on the sleigh. They're out in the elements. So let's see what happens.
We soon found that going over the wild trackless prairie against the wind with a thermometer 40 degrees below zero was a struggle for life. And in order to keep warm, we took turns to walk or run behind the sleigh. In taking his turn, Mr. Willard suddenly sat down in the snow and would not stir. We returned to him, and it required all our power of persuasion to make him take his seat in the sleigh again. He felt very comfortable, he said, and would soon catch up with us again if we only would have left him alone. If we had followed his advice, he never would have left his cold seat again.
-40. too cold to go to school. One of those kind of days. So they're out there riding on the sleigh and they're like, oh, we're so cold. When you're active and moving, it warms up your body, right? So that's why they were taking turns running behind the sleigh. But Mr. Willard, that cold is affecting him so much, he's getting tired. Because when that cold air, when you're out there in that frigid cold for too long, it's your bloodstream starts to slow down. Your body starts to slow down. And when your body's slowing down, you get really tired. What would happen if they had left Mr. Willard to take a little nap to get his energy so he could come join them? What realistically would have happened, Amala? Why? When you fall asleep in weather that cold, you don't wake up again. You think, oh, I'm gonna take a nap to get my energy, but what happens is you take a nap and your body freezes to death. You don't wake up from it. So thank goodness he had these friends who were like, no, we're not leaving you behind. Get up, you're coming with us. And because his friends forced him to get up and move, he saved his life. That's how dangerous it is in these Minnesota winters when it gets that cold. That's why we don't go out for recess. We're only outside for 15 minutes, but we can get frostbite from that. They were outside for a lot longer than 15 minutes, so they were doing all they could to protect themselves so they would survive it. James?
When you're sleeping, doesn't your body like a little bit?
I told you when you get super cold, your body's slowing down, and when you go to sleep, the body just stops when it's this cold. That's what the cold does for your body. I don't know why it's not playing. All right, so building the home. Matson and the others survived their scary experience and chopped down enough trees for a log house. In March, the small group of Swedish immigrants bought as many supplies as they could afford from the stores in Red Wing and set out to build their new homes.
Hundreds of thousands of immigrants have had the same experience and can realize how we felt on that fine March morning. Starting from Red Wing with a wagon loaded with some boards on the bottom of a cook stove and utensils, doors, windows, a keg of nails, a few trunks, and a little box containing our spotted pig. All of us full of hope, strength, and determination to overcome all obstacles and conquer the wildness.
Matson and his family quickly built a small log cabin. Their first few weeks in their new home were difficult. The weather was bad, and their supplies were running out. They could have gone back to Red Wing, but things weren't much better there. The town's store shelves were nearly empty after the long winter. In April, the ice finally broke up on the Mississippi River, and steamboats began arriving with fresh supplies. Matson went to town, stocked up on smoked ham, flour, molasses, coffee, salt, and sugar, and carried the merchandise back to the little cabin. He and his fellow Swedes had survived their first winter in Minnesota.
They survived. Now they have their cabins built. Next winter will be so much easier because they have a house, because they're going to be farming, they're going to have food. That first winter is always the hardest when they're getting set up, getting established.
Attracting newcomers. The immigrants who came to Minnesota could have settled in any number of places. Why did they choose this place? For one thing, they had heard good things about it. Many of the first newcomers to settle in Minnesota wrote letters to their friends and relatives back home. The letters often described Minnesota in glowing terms. A German immigrant named Wenzel Petran sent a series of such letters to his aunt and uncle. Minnesota has a very healthy climate, he wrote, beautiful country and natural scenery, and with its clean, fresh air, it reminds me strongly of the northern part of Germany.
So I went to college at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And one of my roommates was from St. Louis, and she said, oh my goodness, you people from Minnesota, you're kind of crazy. She called us homers, because we loved our home so much, and we talked about how great Minnesota was. And we were in Milwaukee, and we're like, oh, there's this that's wrong with Milwaukee. We love Minnesota. Minnesota has all these amazing things. It's a beautiful state. They have all these trails, all these lakes. You can go up to the cabin, go up and walk the North Shore, but Lake Michigan, or no, Lake Superior here in Minnesota. We compared it to Lake Michigan, where Milwaukee is, and Lake Superior is superior than Lake Michigan. It's better, right? So we were always talking about how great Minnesota was, and she still teases me to this day about how much I love Minnesota. It was the same back then. People are coming into Minnesota saying, wow, this is a beautiful land. It's a beautiful country. And they're sending letters to their relatives back home in the old country saying, come here, it's great. You will love it. There's land, there's lakes. This is just an amazing place. Come visit. Come stay here. So everybody's trying to attract people to come to Minnesota. But sometimes people aren't always honest about it.
Politicians, newspaper editors, and land speculators all spread the word about Minnesota. These and other recruiters worked to get new people to move to Minnesota. Often, recruiters exaggerated the territory's good points. Sometimes they outright lied. One of their unbelievable claims was that disease was almost unheard of in Minnesota, thanks, they said, to the chilly climate. However, anyone who had battled colds and flu symptoms during Minnesota's long winters knew that such claims were questionable.
How many of us have ever been sick while we've lived in Minnesota? Is it non-existent here in Minnesota? No. They were lying. They were trying to get people to come to Minnesota. Why would they lie about it? There's so much great about Minnesota. Why are they lying, trying to get even more people to come? Why did we want so many people to come to Minnesota? Adeline?
So we could become a state.
We needed our population to grow so we could become a state. So recruiters would do this, it's called propaganda, when you're trying to get people to like what you want them to like. They wanted people to like Minnesota. So they used propaganda techniques to not always tell the truth or to stretch that truth so people would move here. All right, a community grows. Number 10 says, what were some reasons that people emigrated from Europe? When you emigrate with the E, you are leaving an area. So what were reasons why people wanted to leave their homelands, their home countries, to come to Minnesota? When you come into a place, you are an immigrant. So they immigrated into the United States to Minnesota. But that's with an I. We just talked about reasons why they want to come into Minnesota.
These are your Thursday afternoon announcements. Some really fun and exciting things. Tomorrow is Valentine's Day, which means that you can come to school in your Valentine's Day color. That means out of uniform, but you must be in some sort of Valentine's Day color. Along with that, this is a very important reminder to everyone that there are no Uggs, slippers, or any shoes of those sorts tomorrow. They must be school-appropriate shoes. If you have questions on that, please take a look at our handbook at home. Moving forward, we've got, if you have any Catholic United Financial Raffle tickets, make sure you turn those into the office. Bring them. Tomorrow is the final day to turn those in, so please make sure if you have not turned in your Catholic United Financial Raffle tickets, bring them tomorrow. And lastly, it is conference day, so support staff, if you could please be outside to help with Carlin, that would be greatly appreciated. Teachers, you do not need to be out there. That is all I have for you. Remember to be kind, be brave, believe, be strong and courageous, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Have a wonderful Thursday afternoon.
So we've talked about the amazing things that were pulling people into Minnesota and how great Minnesota is, but number 10 is asking why they're leaving their homeland. So not just coming here, but why did they want to leave? Why were they emigrating? So we're going to listen for why they would leave.
A community grows. Mattsson began writing a series of letters that appeared in Hemlandet, the homeland, a Swedish-language newspaper published in Chicago. The letters described life in Minnesota and urged other Swedes to come. Many did just that. In the summer of 1855, the growing group of Swedes who lived in Mattsson's settlement officially formed the township of Vasa. The Swedes weren't the only immigrants arriving in Minnesota at this time. Hans Matson recalled what it was like.
So this is telling why they would immigrate to Minnesota. So we're not at the emigrating part. We're not at why they're leaving yet. So don't be filling anything in yet. Okay, while the Swedes were pouring into our place, let me turn the page. While the Swedes were pouring into our place, our friends the Norwegians had started a prosperous settlement a few miles to the south, many of them coming overland from Wisconsin, bringing cattle, implements, and other valuables of which the Swedes, being mostly poor newcomers, were destitute. Many immigrants of both nationalities came as deck passengers on the Mississippi steamboats to Red Wing. So let's see why all these immigrants are coming. So it does say what were some reasons, plural, so more than one reason why. I believe I counted off 4 reasons you could list.
Thousands of new settlers arrived in Minnesota each year, seeking a better life. Many of the Norwegians had left Norway because land and jobs were scarce there. Families from southern Ireland had come to escape the terrible famines that left people starving in their homeland. The biggest immigrant group during the 1850s was the Germans, many of whom had fled wars back home. Newcomers from New England and other parts of the East continued to arrive too.
There are 4 reasons that were listed as to why people were leaving their home country. So what was pushing them out, why they were emigrating out of their country.
Do you need to list all of them or just like 2?
It says, what were some reasons that people emigrated? I always like to be on the safe side and list all of them. It's not that many, but you need more than 1.
Boatload after boatload of immigrants landed in the towns along the rivers and spread out into the country beyond. Soon, there were whole communities where people continued to speak their native languages and few spoke English. The names of some of these places told where people had come from. Besides Vasa, there were New Ulm, New Prague, St. Patrick, Scandia, Heidelberg, and many other names that called to mind homelands far away. Before long, Minnesota was not only the New England of the West, but also the New Sweden, the New Norway, and the New Germany.
So that requirements for becoming a state, I'm going to have you read on your own, okay, because that's not on the reading guide or the comprehensive page, but I'm just going to have you read it on your own, what Minnesota did to become a state. Let's look at statehood for Minnesota.
Statehood for Minnesota. With its population exploding, Minnesotans launched a drive for statehood. There were many advantages to being a state rather than a territory. States are more independent than territories because the federal government has less control over states than it does over territories. As a state, Minnesota would be able to control its own finances and create its own budget. It would have more independence to deal with private companies such as the railroad companies that were laying tracks to the west. It would also have more representatives in the U.S. Congress and, therefore, more influence in national affairs.
Now this is important, this next paragraph, because if you look back on your first, question number 1, you had to fill in years that things happened, and we didn't have all of those years filled in. Okay, so Minnesota approves a constitution. We need to listen.
Before Minnesota could become a state, however, it needed a constitution that set the rules for how the state government would operate. In the summer of 1857, more than 100 delegates from around the territory gathered in St. Paul for a constitutional convention. The meeting did not go well. It quickly broke into 2 separate conventions, one for each of the 2 major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. Each convention produced its own constitution and refused to accept the other side's version. For a while, it looked like the drive for statehood would fail. Finally, after more than a month of arguing, the two parties resolved their differences and agreed to a single document. Minnesota voters approved the new Constitution in October of 1857. On May 11, 1858, the U.S. Congress passed a law making Minnesota the 32nd state in the Union. In a speech to the legislature, the state's first governor, Henry Sibley, described Minnesota as the newest member of the American family.
She extends a friendly hand to all her sisters, north and south, and gives them assurance that she joins their ranks not to provoke sectional discord or to engender strife, but to promote harmony and goodwill and to lend her aid on all occasions in maintaining the integrity of the Union.
Sibley and most other Minnesotans feared that the family they had just joined was about to break apart. They were correct. The Civil War would erupt in 1861 and last 4 long years.
So, we see when we adopted our Constitution, we need to fill that year in on the front, the year that Minnesota becomes a state. So if we look at that number 1, you should have all the years filled in now. So now we have these lines that are in front of those sentences. It says, find the years for each event, so we filled in our years. Now we're going to put them in order. So the oldest year, I think it's 1840 something. So follow along with what I'm saying so you're not going to miss it. So the oldest, you see, you didn't even fill that in. So the oldest year, 1849, would have a 1 on that first line. Then the next year that is closest to that would be 2, then 3, then 4, then 5. Eleanor? Yeah. So what is newer, 1849 or 1858? Yeah. So I'm telling you the first one so you can follow the order. Okay? So make sure you finish up that number 1. You should have all the years filled in because we just learned it if we were following along with us. Okay, that's why I say things. You have to follow along so we don't miss it. So find the year that the Constitution was approved so you can fill it in. All right, so then that number 11, what were the advantages of becoming a state? So if we looked at that first paragraph under statement for Minnesota, it had advantages listed. It is plural. You need more than one advantage. So make sure you're putting more than one advantage for number 11. Now we're at number 12, that sidebar, same name, different powers. What were 3 things established by Minnesota's Constitution?
So what?
To list the
Same name, different powers. Does this book sometimes remind you of studying American history last year? Most likely you remember learning about the U.S. Constitution. It is, after all, one of the most famous legal documents in the world. The U.S. Constitution explains how our national government is set up. The Constitution is important because it influences what government is allowed to do and not do throughout the United States.
Even though the U.S. Constitution gets most of the attention, each state has its own constitution too. Minnesota's Constitution also describes a government's powers. Unlike the U.S. one, though, ours applies only to our state. So if it is the United States Constitution, everybody in the United States follows it. But the Minnesota Constitution only applies to the laws that are here in Minnesota. So we might have some laws that are different than other states because it applies just to Minnesota. Political parties argued about creating Minnesota's Constitution. They knew that it would have an effect on life in the state and well into the future. Yes, this document affects your life today. Imagine not having state boundaries. How would you know when you're here and when you're in Wisconsin? Then and now, every law passed in Minnesota must follow the rules set up in the state constitution. The Constitution Minnesotans approved in October of 1857 set up the state's government. Among other things, important things, it set the state's boundaries. It granted the right to vote to free white male citizens. Now in the future, everybody gets the right to vote. Women get the right to vote. African Americans get the right to vote. Native Americans get the right to vote. But it started with just the free white male citizens. And it divided state power among the three branches, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. So those three important things were established by the Minnesota Constitution. And our last one, understanding federalism. So if we look at that box about understanding federalism, we need to know that power is divided into two levels of government. You need to list the two levels of government. Federalism, or a federal system of government, is one in which power is divided so that no one level has complete control. Certain powers, like the power to declare war on another country, are held by the national government. Many other powers, such as how schools are funded, belong to state governments. So we've got our two different types of governments. States allow local governments to oversee laws that affect smaller regions and communities. In the United States, the federal government controls territories. States occupy their own level. This means a state has much more control over its affairs than a territory does. The power held by states was appealing to leaders who wanted Minnesota to become a state so they could have control over themselves, not have the U.S. government telling them every single thing they have to do. When they are a state government, they can have some of their own control with their own constitution. So at this point, we should have our comprehension page done. If it is not finished, it is homework. So bring your book home. We're going to turn these in tomorrow. So you need to make sure it is all filled out. If you are all done, you can put your book back on the shelf. If you are not done, bring it home and work on it. If you are listening to this at home, I hope you are well and I hope to see you soon.